Good morning. Because what we are going to talk about, jumping right in, is that often in clinical care we have to make choices about what to do, what not to do. Those choices sometimes can, despite our best efforts, result in conflict, and that conflict can lead to lots of consternation and confusion. Can you hear me? Examples of this, we've heard several, just from Anne's talk, of potentially seizure medications, i.e. requests for care outside the standard practice. If it's complementary alternative medicine, it's not working. Okay. It could be that we are talking about, as Doug mentioned, something like immunizations, or as Anne was emphasizing, something more substantial like life-prolonging therapy. It could be withholding prognostic information, diagnostic information, that came up. Requests to provide intensive interventions when the clinical team doesn't think that they are going to be helpful, or to continue to provide care in the face of mounting degrees of essentially abusive interactions. What I'm going to try to do, and I admit I took a very big apple, and I'm only going to be able to take a small bite out of it, is to think about some of the concepts and the way that we think about these situations to try to create a landscape, a kind of mental model landscape that would enable us to start to, I hope, advance the ways that we are talking about the problem, and I'm advancing it. We've done everything that Anne has talked about. We will come back, I promise, in the back end of the talk to emphasize some of those points again, but I want to get to the point where we are at an impasse. What do we do now? Now, for those of you who know me in the palliative care space and the ethics space, I am 98% of the time about the advantages of getting a deeper mutual understanding, making sure that we are not miscommunicating, that we don't have a mental model that just is like ships in the night passing each other. But 2% of the time, 1 out of 50 cases, on the ethics consult side, no matter what skills I bring to the interaction, and no matter what great work has been done long before I showed up or concurrent with where I am, we still are left with what seems to be an intractable conflict. Now, I wish the news was different. Doug sort of said this. Sometimes the choices, and there's a wonderful book on tragic choices, of choices where option A and option B are the only two options, and both of them have really bad downsides. The book is actually thinking through how, at an organizational level, a sort of governance level, do you manage that problem? Because it takes a lot out of people to have to confront choices. Now, tragic is emphasizing they're hard, they're painful, they may in fact be tragic, but they're really, really difficult, and they have hardships and burdens attached to them. This talk is not going to be fun. Guaranteed. It's the first time I've ever said that in front of a talk, but you're probably not going to like parts of it. I think as we talk about how we decide when we put a hard stop at the end of, what is a bridge too far, you may wind up being angry with the arguments I'm trying to advance. And I don't know that I'm advancing arguments per se about how to think of any given case. I'm trying to provide a framework so that we can actually start to dialogue about where we are in fact different. Part of the problem is that we live in a very complex world where things are not black and white, they're continuous, and they're often multidimensional. But we have simpler minds. I'm the first to admit it. I am easily overwhelmed. I'm looking out at this audience, my Lord, there are a lot of people out there. How am I going to relate to the audience? It's too much. So we tend to simplify things. We use heuristics, which I will come back to simplify the process of dealing with a complex world. And one of the key things that I see over and over again is we like to take a complex, continuous world and make it dichotomous into yes, no, right, wrong, black, white, and that creates all sorts of downstream consequences that we suffer with. Another one of the problems is what is motivating this talk. I do believe that there exists moral boundary conditions, meaning we can't agree with everything that everybody says. There are situations where we need to break from accommodate and figure out how to come to mutually agreeable solutions. There are conditions where we can't cross a line. Where that line is debatable. But my deep premise in this talk is that there are conditions, and no matter how relativistic we are and mind expanded and open we are, there will be cases where we just can't go there. How do we know that? When do we know that? On what basis do we know that? One of the other problems is that I love to think. We are trained to think. We go to school to learn how to think. And then we've got this, which is probably doing most of the thinking for us when we get into a conflict. So all of you have taken classes on how to analyze an ethics case, or many of you have. How many of you have taken classes on how to manage your emotions while dealing? So there are a few. That's emerging. But we have to deal with the emotions that are part of what we're addressing. So my 5-part agenda, I said it's a big apple. Then I'm going to do some justice to some parts of it, and then I'm going to, like skipping a stone across the water, just have to skim across. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about the idea of tolerance. I dove into the talk. Doug asked me, what are you working on in this space? And I said, I'm very interested in tolerance and integrity. So I went and started to read more, and the more I read, the more I realized I was not nearly well read enough about all of the different debates going on in the political science sphere, in the moral philosophy sphere about tolerance. We're going to cover some of that. And then I'm going to skip over to another area which is in the realm of labor law about accommodation, to think about where do we go with accommodation and where are the stops that that model puts in place of a bridge too far. We will quickly go through the realm of power relationships, freedom, and revisit this notion of hardship. And we will also do similarly with professionalism, but I'm going to move very quick there because I want to reserve time at the end to talk about some heuristics that I think that we use, techniques and heuristics, to decide where do we draw some of these lines. All right, my principal thesis is that when you look at what I'm going to call principal conflict management, to be principled, I believe chief principle and main goal is to figure out how to partner and collaborate. But if we're going to be principled, we have to have respect for our boundary conditions. It requires the exercise of tolerance, which is to say a virtue. So I'm moving into, for those of you who like to think of this, the virtue ethics space, a virtue of having an ability to judge about whether a particular request or refusal on the behalf of a patient by maybe the parents of the patient herself should be accommodated, and which should be resisted or opposed, and to what degree should we resist or oppose, as well as the virtue of being able to abide in this state of not being in agreement. If we enter into not the resistance and opposing, but a state where, as Doug said, it doesn't sit well with us, but it still may be, on balance, the best that we can do. And I think okay, am I going to say anything political? No, rein it back. In this era, I think one of the things that is not being thought through is what a virtue it is to be able to disagree and abide each other. So last night, we went out to dinner and we had a conversation. We talked about many things, state of the world, and I needed to go for a long run after that. I mean, just saying. So what about some alternatives? And I just want to say I'm a big believer in mediation, and some of what Ann was saying sort of goes into the space where a mediator can be very helpful, coming up with new options, et cetera. But even in the mediation framework, you're still going to have this problem of where do we say, okay, we will meet you halfway, 3/4 way, but there will be a point for some cases where we cannot meet you where you want to be met. So you're still going to have to do this work. Shared decision making, all of the models that we have about how to collaborate better, another talk, I would love to talk about them. This is when you've got to a point where we're still having a problem. Okay. So tolerance. What are we going to do about tolerance? Tolerance, number one, can be viewed in a very naive way as simply acceptance. If I tolerate you, I accept you. And I think because of a variety of huge injustices, there is a general notion that tolerance should be this big tent. We need a big tent and we all need to just respect each other. I have no problem with that notion, but it is an incomplete notion of what tolerance could be. I'd actually just simply call it acceptance. And in fact, as I'm about to say, there are some people who think this may actually have a dark side. The dark side would be that if I'm tolerating you, I'm sort of putting myself in a position of power to actually say, I have the power to tolerate you. I'm sort of in a condescending way saying, I think I can tolerate you, and that I have some kind of self-righteous authority. And that clearly has a kind of arrogant dark side to it. And I get that. And then you hear some people say, well, we should tolerate that. And you can tell they're like, but we're superior, our point of view is better. I hear that loud and clear. On the other side of the political spectrum, or the sort of righteousness spectrum, are the people who are now saying tolerance is simply acquiescence, and that we are tolerating things, but we're losing our moral fiber, our backbone. That to critically accept everything, anybody, any position, is not what we should be doing. This argument tends to use sort of reductio ad absurdum examples of where you clearly would not. They take the extreme examples and say we shouldn't tolerate that. So tolerance writ large is a bad idea. And that's clearly not a logically connected argument. But I also hear there needs to be a boundary condition. Okay, so we can't get arrogant about this, and we can't basically go in any kind of direction. There is a boundary condition. So let me use a metaphor then where sort of tolerance is also used in mechanical engineering, where you can think of basically two parts, two cogs in a wheel. And if we design them, we know if this is the powered part and it has to interdigitate with the other part, there's a zone of the design where it will do that. If I misdesign it and they miss, nothing will work. If I misdesign it too far the other way, they will jam. So the tolerance in mechanical engineering is basically that range in which two parts can still function together and do it reasonably reliably. And there often is an optimal point where things would really work great, but then there's a zone on either side where they will work well enough. Okay? And sort of alluded to this of our emphasis on the best interest standard, not necessarily just the golden rule, but the best interest standard, which the Academy and others makes us tend to think it's the optimization. We need to get the best. And then we get into all sorts of arguments, whereas if we simply said, and I'm not afraid of being, like, hey, it's good enough. I don't think the American Academy of Pediatrics is going to come up with the, hey, it's good enough standard. I'm looking at Doug, but this is going to come back when we talk about heuristics and how we actually make judgments, because the kind of high-level trade-offs between what is potentially optimal from an engineering point about seizure control medicines and what will in fact work with the multiple parts that had to work for Leah's case is one where you are making trade-offs and you have to understand the system's tolerance to still work good enough to give us what may in fact be the best outcome. The problem with the best interest standard is it tends to make us zero in on one aspect of the problem and ignore other parts of the system. All right, so People who know me, I love pictures. This is one way I think we think of when we talk about tolerance. Well, we're going to agree, and what we're really trying to do by becoming more tolerant is just push that, the blue zone over towards, okay, we're going to try not to disagree as much, right? But I want to put a very different idea in our mind, that what we really are doing is two separate tasks. One of which is, again, I'm going to pick on my best friend here. If we were having a discussion and I said, I don't agree with you, but I may be able to get to a point where I can still abide our ongoing collaboration, but I don't need to concede that I agree. Again, these days that is a hard position to strike. It's just not the tenor of the times as we get more polarized. But it would be lovely if it came back, because now I can do a couple of things. I can say with integrity, come on, I still don't agree with you, but I know the way you want to do things, and although I disagree, I can support that to some degree. So we enter into what I'm going to call non-agreeing abidance of the plan. Now, that's a big bunch of words, and I wish I could come up with something pithier, but I'll come back to why I think it's important not simply to call it a gray zone. And that is different than active resistance, where now I'm sorry, I can't do this. I'm either going to actively resist by withdrawing from the relationship, I'm actively going to resist by sort of leaning on you much harder. And when we become more tolerant, this side of the green zone may or may not have to change. I would love it, particularly for certain views, if it did change, but I don't think it has to change for everything. What we also have to explore is how far to, if you will, towards the red zone we go, and where do we draw that line. What I'm saying is the virtue of tolerance is both being able to understand the green zone and then be able to sit in it and be able to tolerate that at a emotional and a social level, a group level. All right, so let me unpack this again. It's really the essence of this talk. If tolerance is non-agreeing abidance, because we're talking about not mechanical parts, but human interactions, it is acknowledging that agreement is not always possible, but collaborative action could still occur. So I don't need to even agree that the herbal medicines are worth doing, but I could still collaborate, and maybe even the animal sacrifice or other things, I could potentially not resist it. And that would be, as I'm sort of trying to define it, a kind of tolerance. It does require one of the parties, either the physician or, in many cases, the parents are tolerating us, because we really are not the easiest people to get along with at times, that the parties are going to have to act beyond their narrowly conceived self-interest. Although some people, best interest standard, it's all about the patient, I've yet to meet a care team that is not at some level also thinking about themselves, and I'll own it. Okay, I am definitely a very narcissistic, selfish individual, and I think about myself all the time. Okay, so I'm not pointing fingers. But what I may be thinking about is, am I being a good doctor? Am I doing the right thing for this child? So I'm thinking about the child and what is in the child's best interest, but I have a flood of thoughts that are informing me about my sense of duty and what I owe that child, whether it be the golden rule, I owe that child like I was taking care of my own child. That immediately starts to shape the way I'm going to think about what I can and can't do. Can I let go of that? Can I treat this child like it's not my child, but it's Leah and it's their child? All right, so let me divide this up. So part of tolerance is a judgment. It's not simply a vague moral capacity. I have to decide, I have to judge, when should I enter into that state of not agreeing with it, but I am going to abide it. These conditions, certainly I also have to decide when I'm going to exit I can't abide it anymore because of the boundary conditions. The second is that I'm going to have to decide the degree to which I am going to accept it. And I can use the example from smoking cessation. We have learned over the years that people who smoke, who get repeated queries from their doctor about whether would you be interested in quitting, have you tried quitting? And even if people say, no, not now, that practice of not actively accepting smoking status, not trying to say, I'm firing you from my practice, you're not welcome here anymore, but this low level of active resistance to people continuing to pursue a health strategy, a behavior that ample data that it's not in their best interest from a physiologic and health point of view, that can be helpful. So I think that there's more thought about what are we doing in this zone. Immunization resistance is the same thing. It doesn't need to be all or nothing, and I worry when people will go all gangsta. Wow, I'm getting rid of them. That's getting perhaps a little bit too, they're not understanding the power of enforcement. All right, there's a range of complete resistance to lower levels of nudging and other things. And then the last part, and I can't emphasize this enough, if Lord forbid you or your hospital, your colleagues are stuck in a situation where you have to abide and you really do not agree, it is a tremendous calorie burn on one's moral resources. That's the extreme state where you really wish that you had the ability to exit. But even in states like we're not going to tell that child his or her prognosis. Why would we not do that? Well, the child probably already knows, and maybe there's evidence that knowing explicitly from the doctor would help the child. And although I will say the data for that is much more, in my view, suspect. I think we, in fact, do not know as clearly as I wish we knew in the setting of a conflict about whether to talk about it. Because I have seen the big reveal, and most of the time the kid goes, yeah, tell me something I don't know. But then I've seen the family really struggle within the family now that the knowledge is out. It's not just the aftermath for the parents. The child often does not benefit the way that we fantasize they will benefit by the big reveal. Anyway, if we're having to abide in a state where if it were my child, I would, but now I'm not going to for the variety of reasons I just sketched, how do I sit with that and go in day after day? I get that that is not easy, but I never thought that the job of going into healthcare was going to be easy. So it's just not easy, but it may be part of the job to some limit if there is a justification for this abidance. All right. So keep this in your mind. It's not simply a gray zone, if I go back to this, which is a lovely phrase, which often is talking about like gray zones of uncertainty and we just don't know. One is that does leave the cognition that's going on in figuring out, okay, where is that gray zone and how do we decide when we're in it, when we're out of it? And I'm also saying we could be crystal clear that I really do not agree with you on this, and yet I am going to abide. So it is a kind of gray zone in terms of this abidance where we're not into active resistance, but we're not in agreement. But I think spelling this out a little bit more is going to be helpful. All right, now I'm going to start skipping the stone. If we look at what is going on in the world of accommodation, and I'm thinking here specifically about accommodation for disabilities, and I am not qualified to talk about this, so just take this all with a grain of salt. There are a number of reasons to potentially accommodate, and it's often thought of in that setting as the non-self-interest that I'm going to have to pay to enable the accommodation. How much, though, is against self-interest? Because there is a boundary condition on how far you go. It has to be a reasonable accommodation, and it can't go up to the level of undue hardship. All right, again, this is a very different area, but I'm going to import it in and see if it does any work for us. So if we were to try to apply that, and I will point out, again, this is the complex world, people tend to think of accommodation as a right but it is a qualified right. I'm sort of, as I'm reading this, realizing it's not as clear. It is something that winds up being truncated if you get to these stop points. So it's an interesting way, and I'm sure that people who understand labor law will be cringing right now, but as I import it in, I think that there are certain stops that have been placed on this particular way of thinking about accommodation. So if we applied that to the medical setting, we would try to enter into this zone of accommodation of essentially non-agreeing abidance up to the point that one of the parties is suffering undue hardship, and it has to be reasonable that we enter into it. So we'd have to unpack these things. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to start to move quicker. One of the things about reasonableness is it's very hard to actually decide what is reasonable. Okay? A lot is in the eye of the beholder. Clearly, it will have something to do with function and what the outcome and the outcome expectancy, but let's just say it's complicated. All right? Anybody who pretends that it's crystal clear, I think, is not understanding the multiple dimensions, the multiple outcomes. Sometimes it's about function of, I have a cord injury. Will I ever be able to walk over and get the bottle? Maybe I actually just simply want to, the function I want is to remain a fighter against this injury that happened to me. So it very quickly becomes a framing effect of what you're trying to do. But, and I think Doug deserves a major shout out for this, when I see people talking about whether something is futile, et cetera, we never debate the futility of many of the things we do in medical care that really probably don't work that much, right? As long as they don't cause harm. Where we start to pull out the futility argument is where there's great harm or great cost. Check. The number of times you get a consult about, the family wants to use acetaminophen for this, and it's just not going to ever work. We think it's futile care. Like, that doesn't come in, okay? What you do get, so it's basically having to understand the degree of harm. And notice how in the conversation that Doug and Ann just had, it kept coming back to what was the degree of harm that was likely to occur in the cases that they ran through. All right, the undue hardship piece is the part that we really don't think about and typically argue. It's coming up, is like mushrooms that sprout in different places called moral distress. Okay, and I don't mean to be disparaging of moral distress by that metaphor, but we're not even saying what is happening in the setting of moral distress is we're putting people under incredible burden. And it is manifesting as all of this psychological distress that they can point back to a particular choice that was made within the team or between the team and the family, and it is generating hardship. Now, in the US context, we often pretend that we're resource unconstrained. One of the huge constraints that we actually have to deal with is the impact that some of the choices we make have on the clinical frontline staff. It has to be accounted for. There are costs, there are opportunity costs. So maybe the argument is about bed space and things like that, but I'm much more worried about the people that are actually in there having to provide care. There was a discussion yesterday about a child who was on ECMO, and there was no possibility of cure, and there was a debate about whether to stop it. And we've dealt with this in my hospital. And things that you quickly realize, okay, name all the people in the room. Well, we got the doctors, we got the nurses, you have the ECMO tech. The person who is actually sitting at the ECMO circuit, watching the blood flow, shining the flashlight, hoping to God that the circuit does not act up. And the strategy of we're not going to stop the ECMO, we're going to have, and I'm going to say this out loud, just prepare, death by disaster. The ECMO circuit will have to fail, and that's what's going to result in the patient's death. And you know who's going to never forget that the rest of his life? Is the ECMO tech who thought, if I had only, because no matter how much it is inevitable that a circuit will eventually fail, nobody wants to be manning the deck when that happens. We owe it to that person to not let them hang out to dry. certain forms of care, blah, blah, blah. All right, if I'm gonna do the skipping of the stone, sorry. What about patients and families? Very, very important. So this may sound like it's all about the doctor. I do not want to make that. If we are asking and putting undue hardships on the family, that should also be cause to stop, and certainly asking for their child to go away. So we are gonna have to think about both sides, which leads us to think about the range from where I'm happily doing it to we've just capitulated, we're being forced, or begrudging compromise, and the amount of distress. We need more work to understand the hardship. And I don't think the moral distress framework, without it being broken down more, is going to give us enough clarity about the hardships that are occurring when we are compelling members of the hospital staff to do things that either they don't believe is right or in fact nobody in the hospital would believe is right. Which leads us to power relationships. All right, so we got the parent and the family. And almost everybody would say, well, that's imbalanced. The medical team has so much power and authority, and I get that. Or is that the whole story? In ethics, we admit that there's power, and that's usually where our analysis stops. Okay, we need to do a much better job, a much more finely grained job of understanding who has power and how is it exercised. So I went through my PhD program in history, Michel Foucault. I still don't understand what he was writing. But what he was clearly trying to show is that the exercise of power does not occur simply by the ways that you might think. It can occur in institutional arrangements. It can occur in sort of the micro level as well as, and the structural world as well as authority. How many of you are thinking of these things when you actually think about and analyzing how do we understand what is actually happening in hospitals? To really think that a patient or a parent is powerless is inaccurate. I'll just leave it as inaccurate. It may also be belittling. I don't think that they have unlimited power, but to also think that physicians and nurses and the healthcare system is all powerful is also, I think, outdated. Okay? It is a new world that we live in where anybody with a Twitter account and the ability to mobilize resources online, and that goes both ways, has much more power and authority in ways that we hadn't even been able to think about 15, 20 years ago. We need to catch up on that a little bit. The social transformation of medicine is ongoing. And again, I don't want to get out the little violin about how bad I wish. No, it's just simply that we're not paying attention and we're not understanding the ways the power, whether it be monetary power or social media power or other forms of using resources to get people to potentially change the way that they are going to act is happening in healthcare. Last thing I want to add into this is that there are both positive and negative freedoms in ways of thinking about this. And when we talk about accommodating and tolerance, the old notion of sort of religious tolerance is you are free to exist in our community on your own. We're not going to go and do something terrible to you. The religious wars, when the ideas of tolerance first really started to gain, we have to tolerate, because otherwise it's just blood everywhere. But it was more, you had the freedom to be left alone. There is a positive notion of freedom that I actually am going to be free, but you have to enable me by actually bestowing particular things upon me, my requests. And I will just point out that when we think about what we are going to draw that line, are we dealing with a refusal where we just have to leave them alone? All they're saying is, don't put your stuff on me, versus an active request. No, I need you to continue to do this, where we are being compelled if we don't agree with it. And we may abide it, but we're being compelled. I think that those are different classes of problems. Last thing I'm going to throw in here, again, I'm sorry for the speed I'm going, but there's just an awful lot to think about, is where are we talking about on the hierarchy? So I gave you the example of the ECMO tech, who is at the point of care. And we live in increasingly complex hospital systems with huge reach. And some of the decisions that are being made that have ultimately funneled down are being made at a very different level of the hierarchy. And we'll come back to a practical way of thinking about how we might grapple with that. This is where I'm actually trying to point to the fact that as we think about a sort of mutually voluntary association, which if in the history of medicine was the way medical interactions were largely conducted until latter part of the, 1920s, things start to change. Okay, and I'm much for the better. I'm not trying to say, oh, the good old days, but it was a mutually agreeable, and in the law, except for EMTALA, most medical encounters are still presumed to be mutually voluntary. But we wind up getting into situations where it doesn't feel like either party, and we definitely focus on the families where the child is just too sick to be transferred, they're sort of captured, but we also have the reciprocal, the other side of the coin, where we also cannot disengage readily from the encounter. All right, can I skip this part entirely? Other than to say, many people, and again, the notes are there, I did update the talk, so the word for word there may be a little bit of difference. Professionalism is an idea that I think is great, but is, I don't actually use it that much. I think a lot goes on under the hood and it has a kind of circularity, and we're not going to be able to really unpack what we need to do by simply saying you have a professional duty to provide care. Get a lot of people upset with that. All right, so recap, we've got these different zones. We have an awful lot to think about. We're going to have to simplify the situation somehow, so we inevitably will use heuristics. So the only shot we have at this, from my point of view, is to be mindful about what heuristics we are going to use and pick them. All right? So what would we potentially do? We've talked about a range of examples. One, and I'm going to go through this quickly, is there a law on this? Ethics isn't law, yeah, get it. But it's always good to know what the law says. Sometimes what is being proposed, requested or refused, the law says it's not a valid option. But most often the law is silent. So what is the patient's current clinical status? I find that doing work on actually clarifying what is actually going on with the patient, no matter how many times they've been discussed on rounds of what is the actual prognosis, what is the likelihood that this patient can survive this illness, what does the patient already know, is always a helpful exercise. Clarifying all the stakeholders, not necessarily to bring them into a room, but I need to think of everybody, including the ECMO tech, including the environmental service people that come in. If they are involved in some manifest way that they're influenced by this case, now I get that patient first. I'm very patient-centric, but I engage families. I don't talk about family-centric care. I know I'm like saying one thing after the next, it's wrong. I believe in patient-centered care with family engagement. And I also believe in engaging as many members of the medical team so I understand what they are being asked to do. Name the emotions. Right now, I am panicking because I see I have 6 minutes there, but I know that Ben needs me to end in about a minute. If we name emotions, I will often start a meeting by saying, thank you everybody for being here. I know we're incredibly frustrated and angry. What we know about emotional management is that naming some feelings allows you to start to be able to handle them and potentially see how they are influencing your cognition, because they will influence your cognition. I've mentioned this already, exploring the sense of duty I've written about. Pam Hines and I, and Pam really pioneered some of the concepts of the good parent heuristic, and then we were able to study it, of what do parents feel that they need to do to be a good parent. Different phenotypes. Some think, I need to love my child. Well, what does that mean for you? Again, it's like professionalism. It's a big idea. It's a wonderful idea. What does it mean for you? Or they feel like they have to advocate, or they have to focus on their child's health. What does that mean in the setting of a child who's really ill? Myra talked about a parent who said, he's just a normal sick kid. a healthy sick kid. That's the way the parents think. What's going on for them? What's going on, the sense of duty of that ECMO tech? I can't emphasize this enough. Oh, it's going to be harmful. Well, how harmful? And this was the exercise that we were going through with Anne. People, well, I'm a lazy individual. If I can take a shortcut and not have to think something all the way through, I will do it. Slowing a team down and actually trying to get what harms will come from it, what's the likelihood of the harm, let's put that harm in the context of what's going on overall, that can be very helpful. Likewise, the size of the benefit. I was out to dinner last night, we were talking about bone marrow transplant. Is it 60% chance of long-term excellent outcome, or is it 70 or 80? Or is it 40? And most people look at me, I can't tell you that. Well, then you can't make a decision. You've got to tell me what you think it is, because I can't put that in the scale against the harm that we would be causing if you're unwilling to commit to the prospect of benefit. Because we're not going to let this become dichotomized. Oh, it's beneficial. You've got to give me a size. What's the relative ratio? I actually think get rid of futility and talk about grossly disproportional harm to prospect of benefit. That's what actually gets me where we are going to do tremendous amounts of harm and there's almost no prospect of benefit. We need to actually resist. Now, the last three. The blindfold test. If somebody comes to me and asks for or refuses something and I put a blindfold on, I cannot see that individual. I have no idea what culture they're coming from. I have no idea where in the power hierarchy of the hospital they're from. What decision would I make? This is a mental exercise, and it will not work perfectly, but it is a quick way of detecting I'm actually responding to the person and not to the request in my thinking. I'm too caught up in some aspect of the person. The substitution test. Yeah, we're going to continue ECMO. All right. I have suddenly gone through the ECMO training class, and I now have to staff the ECMO circuit. Well, maybe we should think this through again. Okay, it is all too easy to delegate down and not actually put oneself in the hot seat. If you were there, how would you feel about it? It is a great way to immediately gain empathy for people. Or I'm going to have to be the mom, or the dad, or the brother, or even the patient. These are very powerful ways of actually gaining a sense of what may be going on. And lastly, the policy test. If I am unwilling to make this a policy throughout the entire hospital and post it on a big board this size and say, this is the way we're doing things from here on, why am I not willing to do that? Why are we trying to keep this sort of secret or a one-off? Because I think about fairness, which is a thing we always talk about, and then it always seems to lose any kind of sway on the decisions we make. But one of the problems with these excessive accommodations is we actually do not want anybody else to know. Let's keep this hush-hush. That tells us that we may be embarking on a path that is not sustainable and we may want to re-examine it. All right. In conclusion, I talked an awful lot. Medical care is not easy. There are the zone of non-agreeing abidance, figuring out when to enter it, when to exit it, and how to simply stay in it is what I think we are really talking about in the next couple of day and a half. It's not easy, but it is a professional duty. Look at me talking out both sides of my mouth. That's actually what the duty is, to figure out how to do that and do it well. Thank you.